There is an increase in social welfare cases across Israel. This is because there's dangerous levels of conditions and violence at home and in society. More people in Israel are seeking help than ever before. This includes hundreds of thousands of families. Many of them have sought help for the first time.
It's exceedingly much worse than last year. Our services are exponentially rising. The stats are in front of me. Our amount of food baskets that we give is from 3,500 a week to 4,500 a week. That's more than a 30% increase. There are hundreds of thousands of new poor that are seeking our services.
This is according to Organization of Directors of Social Affairs Offices in local authorities. This organization represents 150 welfare organizations across Israel. The report says that children are the most at risk. There has been an increase in social welfare cases. This is due to the significant number of families seeking help due to dangerous conditions and cases of violence at home. The coronavirus pandemic, along with a political deadlock and no budget, have brought hundreds of thousands of new families to social service departments. This is due to the economic and social distress they are facing. Hundreds of thousands of families have sought state help for the first time. 20% increase in children at risk. There's also a 26% spike in domestic violence. The numbers are from a group of directors of social affairs offices. They are known as the Organization of Directors of Social Affairs Offices in local authorities. The organization represents 150 welfare organizations across Israel. In a report it published in January, the organization claims that there is also a 21.5% rise in the number of calls relating to youth or young adults in distress. There is an affiliated rise in the number of young people threatening or attempting to commit suicide. The data relate to hundreds of thousands of citizens who have appealed for help and reflect not only a dramatic increase in the number of new applications, but also the scope of issues involved.
הארגונים הכלכליים או ארגוני הצדקה שקיימים בישראל הם בדרך כלל עובדים למשפחות ברוכות ילדים או למשפחות שהן במצוקה מבחינה כלכלית. הם בדרך כלל מסייעים למשפחות האלה כל שנה בראש השנה ובערב פסח, כאשר הם מכינים חבילות של מנות למשפחות האלה. בשנה וחצי האחרונות הארגונים האלה, החברתיים, הם חווים מצב כלכלי. המדינה בדרך כלל מסייעת לחברות האלה במתן רשימות של המשפחות שהן חיות במצוקה כדי לסייע להם, אבל גם המדינה, כפי שאת יודעת, היא במצב כספי לא קל. ולכן הרבה מהארגונים האלה שסייעו בעבר למשפחות האלה פשטו רגל. ואני חושב שעל המדינה היום לשאת יותר ויותר, גם בגלל המצוקה הכלכלית שחווה המדינה, לסייע למשפחות האלה כדי לא להוריד אותם מתחת לקו העוני. להורים היום במצב של הקורונה יש בעיה קשה מאוד. אם זה ההורים שיש להם בנים שהם סטודנטים באוניברסיטה, או שהם זוג צעיר. במצב הכלכלי היום שיש הרבה חברות או עסקים שפשטו רגל בגלל הקורונה, קשה מאוד להורים היום לסייע לילדים. יש הרבה ילדים, נוער, או אפילו סטודנטים, או אפילו זוגות צעירים, שבגלל המצב הכלכלי חזרו לגור עם ההורים בגלל הנושא הזה. זה לא טוב, כי זה לא מאפשר להתפתח מבחינה חברתית ומבחינה כלכלית, אבל מקווים שעם חלוף הבעיה של הקורונה, המצב הכלכלי ישתפר יותר, אם כי יש בעיות כלכליות קשות מאוד במדינה בתקופה הזו. הממשלה יש לה אמצעים לא דלים. יש בעיות ביטחוניות קשות מאוד במזרח התיכון. אין תקציב מזה יותר משנתיים. ולכן הכלכלה בישראל חיה על כלכלה, על תקציב שהוא המשך, אבל לא תקציב שהוא מתפתח. ולכן למדינה אין הרבה יכולות מבחינה כלכלית. אנחנו שומעים שראש הממשלה ושר האוצר יש להם תוכניות כלכליות לסייע למשפחות ולתת כל מיני מענקים, אבל כמובן שזה יבוא על חשבון הגירעון הכספי והכלכלי במדינת ישראל, כאשר היום הגירעון הכספי במדינת ישראל מגיע ל-160 מיליארד שקל, ומישהו צריך לכסות בעתיד הקרוב, אולי אחרי הבחירות, את כל הגירעון הזה. השאלה מאיפה יביאו את הכספים הללו.
On social media, the conversation took a different turn. Gilad says, in Israel, the leading NGO that supports youth at risk published their numbers, and they are horrendous. Increase of 5 times numbers in youth cases, 4.8 times anxiety and depression, 2 times eating disorders, 5 times domestic violence, 2 times self-abuse, and today we launch another lockdown. Andre says he bets that nobody would be held accountable. Women's Voices says the number of complaints of domestic violence in Israel increased by 300% since March, attributed in part to the 2 coronavirus pandemic-induced closures and the subsequent economic crisis.
I'm self-employed in a year, so all of a sudden I'm also in a different kind of economic situation. You know, the smart people do what they can, but I don't think there really is anybody we were hit with a pandemic we didn't see coming. Nobody knew how to deal with it. And that includes the government. You know, we look to them, but they're just as clueless even today, after a year later. Nobody's really sure what's really going on.
מהשם החברה, אני חושבת, שמסביב. נגיד, יש לי מישהי שאני פה מכירה, אני הולכת אליה כל יום. עכשיו יותר אפילו גם בבוקר אם היא צריכה משהו אני שואלת. אני חושבת שזה אנשים, אני לא יודעת אם הממשלה, אולי גם הממשלה קצת.
המצב בממשלה הוא מאוד לא יציב, קשה. בסיטואציה שקיימת היום קשה להגיע להישגים.
There's been a rise of about 68% of calls reporting domestic violence from Israeli homes to the resource centers and emergency centers. The problem is that we've actually seen a very big decline in elderly people calling, and there's a very high chance, according to various experts, that elderly people are being abused, but they are unable to call. And additionally, we've seen a rise of reports from women and children who are undergoing abuse. The problem is that many children cannot be seen in the schools by the teachers, so the only contact they have with them is through Zoom, and that is why they are unable to really know about their condition and situation. There's no doubt that there's been a very high rise of violence against children in various homes, and larger numbers of children are suffering. The problem is that while if a child goes to school, it's possible to possibly identify if he exhibits certain behavior that shows that he's been beaten at home or may have scars or the way he speaks or isolates himself. In the Zoom era, it's much harder. So while some teachers are somehow able to sense that something is wrong with some students, the percentage of number of students who are being underreported or invisible for the violence that they're being on the receiving end of. And due to unemployment and high pressure and lack of adequate services, there's growing incidents of violence in many homes, and it's all the various after effects are also taking place, including homelessness and extreme violence. The Israeli government didn't really address the issue of violence in homes, although there's been a very large increase. So many of the organizations who are dealing with this, so there really hasn't been a new budget in the country. There's a lack of funding for organizations and for asylums and for schools. So due to all these reasons, there's been a massive underfunding, and this issue has been to a large degree unrecognized and underplayed by the Israeli government.
Iran's Islamic Revolution, one of the most important moments in modern history. Join me next episode as we look back on the movement that defied Britain and America, setting the stage for anti-imperialism for decades to come. I'm Richard Medhurst, and this is The Communique on Press TV.
Since last year, there has been a significant increase in the number of children who urgently need shelter. Among the reasons for this are reports of suspected assault on minors, physically and sexually, and in towns that are considered economically strong. The number of young men and women hanging out in the streets without an educational framework has increased. The directors of social affairs offices demanded the regime establish shelters for children of youth and men who live on the streets and do not have any family support, in the wake of the large number of young men who have been dismissed from their work and forced to leave their apartments. The situation is prevalent in all circles of Israeli society. In fact, in late 2020, the Women's International Zionist Organization, WIZO, a volunteer organization dedicated to social welfare that monitored the amount of calls to domestic violence hotlines, admitted that domestic violence in Israel has increased by 300%. Since the start of 2020, some 20 women were murdered by their spouse, with 18 of the murders having occurred after the coronavirus pandemic Israel in March last year. The report also noted a 350% increase in the number of women asking for help in centers for the prevention and treatment of domestic violence. Of course, women are only another victim. According to the Organization of Directors of Social Affairs Offices in local authorities, the coronavirus pandemic has brought hundreds of thousands of new families to social service departments due to the economic distress they are facing.
המבוי הסתום הוא נמשך יותר משנתיים, והעובדה שאין תקציב זה אומר שאין פיתוח כלכלי במדינה, ולדבר הזה יש השלכות שליליות על כל החיים במדינה הזאת. אם אחרי הבחירות לא יהיה מנוס בכל צורה שהיא להקים ממשלה, כי המשק בישראל לא יכול להחזיק 5 מערכות בחירות בישראל, כי זה עולה הון תועפות, ולכן הם צריכים למצוא במדינה הזו להגיע לפשרה ולהקים ממשלה יציבה, כדי שתצא מה שנקרא מהמבוך הפוליטי והכלכלי. אחרת המשק יחזה או יראה מצב כלכלי קשה מאוד, שיהיה קשה מאוד לישראל לצאת מהמשבר הכלכלי. תראה, אם אנחנו מדברים על איומים חיצוניים שמאיימים על ישראל בעיקר, ישראל יכולה לעמוד מול האיומים האלה מבחינה צבאית. אבל כשיש משבר כלכלי, חברתי, במיוחד בכל הנוגע לחרדים בארץ, שהם, כפי שנאמר, הקימו מדינה בתוך מדינה, והם לא נענים ולא נשמעים להחלטות של המדינה, המשבר החברתי הוא האיום הגדול ביותר על המדינה, ולא האיום הביטחוני והאיום המדיני. כיוון שעם האיומים מהסוג הזה ישראל תוכל להסתדר, משברים בתוך ישראל הם משברים שיכולים לאיים על המדינה ועל העם.
On social media, the conversation took a different turn. Kathy on Twitter says, "We do need to be prepared for a revolution. Who is going to lead and how do we gather and plan?" Rachel asks, "How can we trust the regime to protect women when there is no consensus within our own justice system that domestic violence should be taken seriously? How can we expect women to believe that they are entitled to leave violent relationships when our courts tell them otherwise?" Woman for Just says, "So why did the right block an investigation of domestic violence and murder of women in Israel?"
Because people in the end do what they want to do. And even now we're in a quarantine, but people are walking around. I can go wherever I want. So maybe in a sense, had they enforced it more, but you know, there's only so much. People have to take a personal responsibility also, is what I'm saying.
כנראה שהמוסדות שצריכים לקבל את הכסף, כל מיני מוסדות רווחה, כל מיני מקומות שצריכים לתמוך באנשים האלה, לא מקבלים תקציב, עמותות לא מקבלים תקציב, ובשביל זה אין להם כסף. והאנשים האלה נהיו יותר מסכנים ממה שהיו.
That I have something, because when I watch the news and I hear people talking about the government and vote for this one and elections, people are dying in the streets. I mean, not in the streets, but people are dying. We have much more important things to do than worrying about some Knesset member's seat. You know, I don't care about that. I mean, I'll vote, but I'm not going to invest my energy right now in this. We have more important things to do.
The Israeli government did not open up new centers for abused women. And although there's been a growing number of unemployed and homeless people in the streets, the Israeli government didn't create new centers or host people in new locations. All around the world, in multiple areas, in San Francisco, in Scotland, in London, the local governments and the national governments have been making largely successful efforts in housing homeless people in different locations. The Israeli regime did not do this. It did not create new centers for people. It did not find new locations for people. And also, to a large degree, many Israelis did not want to host homeless people in many areas, whether hotels or Airbnb or other areas. So this did not happen. Right now, there are circumstances in which many fathers and husbands cannot provide for their family. And this, in a growing number of cases, is resulting in violence within the house. and elderly living within the nuclear family, and wives and mothers are encountering violence from their spouses or husbands. And the number of resources available and funding for solutions for this growing domestic violence is entirely inadequate. Additionally, due to the fact that Israel is currently undergoing its third lockdown, there's been, the schools have been closed, as have most employment areas, and that is why there's been lack of proper education and a healthy environment for many students. In the last 10 to 15 years and longer, we've seen a gradual decline of various social services provided by the state to the citizens. And there's been a cutting of funds, so every year the budget has been getting smaller, and then in the last 2 years there was no budget altogether. But what is unique about this current COVID-19 situation is that the Israeli government is now creating the only thing they did is make some centers that were available already during the night. They made them also available during the day. But the number of homeless people is increasing, and there are many children in the streets, and the government is not doing anything about it, and people are growing up without any kind of guidance, which is a very dangerous and explosive situation. To begin with, Israel did not really allocate any new funds to the growing social problems that are taking place. Its only answer historically has been to provide more policing. But right now we have a situation with so many homeless people and so much violence within families and such a poor response from the country, you need to wonder what are they thinking and why aren't they taking care of their own citizens. So what Israel could have done differently was to find solutions for homeless people, find new areas where they could be housed, because the state owns a lot of housed there, and have more of a workforce that could visit families and check on children and elderly and see how they're doing on a one-to-one level of visiting.
So far, there is no plan by the regime to address the issues mentioned, but it is likely that even when the pandemic is over, there will be great pressure on social services due to post-traumatic effects. But what is really worrying is that these figures and numbers are huge for such a small entity such as Israel, and Israeli media is questioning whether or not Israel was ever prepared and how the effects of the political deadlock have truly impacted Israelis, as politicians flex their political muscle while Israelis are the streets. Here are the news making the press in Israel. Haaretz: suicidal tendencies among school pupils up 42% this school year. Educational advisors reported having received tens of thousands of new requests for treatment by students seeking support for loneliness, distress, anxiety, and sexual abuse, according to a new report by Israel's National Council for the Child. Ynet News: Israel's settler population in the occupied West Bank has grown at a far higher rate than the rest of Israel as a whole over the last 4 years, a pro-settler group said, a period that coincides with unprecedented acceptance of settlement activity from former U.S. President Donald Trump. The report by West Bank Jewish Population Stats shows the settler population growing by around 13% since the start of 2017 to reach 475,481. During the same period, Israel's population grew by around 8% to reach nearly 9.3 million, according to the regime. Globes: Israel's Attorney General Avichai Mandelblit has decided to indict, subject to a hearing, former senior executives at Shikun and Binoi Holdings Limited, as well as the company itself, on suspicion of bribing public officials in Africa in order to win infrastructure tenders in Kenya and other countries, sources inform Globes. The Times of Israel: a bill stepping up enforcement of the coronavirus doubling fines for violators, passed its final votes in the Knesset and will become law. The measure was the focus of fierce infighting among the parties in the coalition and had threatened to hold up a vote on extending the nationwide coronavirus lockdown.